Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending. I'm not going to waste any time. I'm just going to jump right into it. My name is Daniel Leising. I work at Technische Universität Dresden, and I'm going to talk about power abuse in academia, responses and prevention. For those of you who have no idea who I am, just a brief personal background. Why do I think I'm like in a situation to talk about all this? My views on these matters, on the matters that I'm going to talk about, reflect my own experiences and observations as a professor, my consulting work for the Network Against Power Abuse in Science, my chairing the German Psychological Society's Commission on Incentive Structure, Power Abuse, and Scientific Misconduct, frequent in-depth exchanges that I had with victims, witnesses, and helpers. I studied quite a bit of the relevant research literature, for example, on whistleblowing. I've been collaborating with journalists on investigative reports, and that's ongoing. I've been following relevant case reports from within academia and the press, but I've also conducted a number of qualitative analysis of well-documented cases outside academia. So in order to be able to compare the patterns of power abuse within academia with those outside academia. I'm going to talk about terminology first. Hope to be able to do that quite briefly. What is power and what is power abuse? I'm going to talk about forms of power abuse, briefly talk about prevalence, and then about causes and about emergency measures and, emergency responses and emergency prevention measures. Just to give you a brief heads up, this is a lot to take in. It's very complex, the whole matter. So I'm probably not going to be able to talk about everything in sufficient depth. But there's going to be a chance for us to talk about stuff that interests you more later in detail. So what is power? What is power abuse? Power, according to Max Weber, who's probably the most cited person in this regard, is within a social relationship, any chance, regardless of the basis of this chance, to carry through one's own will, even against resistance. I find that quite compelling. That's the definition that I use all the time. Why do we have power imbalances at all at work? Why do we need them? In work environments, the establishment of hierarchies often seems inevitable, and it may even be desirable. I think that power differentials per se are not bad, but power is assigned to certain individuals in an institution, in an organization, in order to promote the achievement of certain goals. And in science, these goals would be providing high-quality research for the benefit of society, providing high-quality teaching of students, at universities at least, providing high-quality training and mentoring for ECRs, which means early career researchers, and also a responsible and efficient use of resources in working towards these goals. So we give power, more power to certain people than to other people in order to empower them to help achieve those goals. And what is power abuse? Well, power is being abused if it's used with the intent of achieving goals other than the ones that were the reason for its assignment. So you're given power and you use that power for other goals than the ones that were the reason for you being given that power. Especially if you're trying to achieve personal goals or the goals of the group that you belong to at the expense of others. But professional roles and permissible means also need to be considered, because sometimes beating the competition is actually part of the job. So that's like another complication there in the definition. Key questions to me when I'm talking about power abuse are always who benefits, who pays, how acceptable is that cost-benefit relationship, and how acceptable are the means for which it is achieved. There are also more informal sources of power, so power that is not conveyed, that is not formally assigned to someone, but that the person has nevertheless. For example, if you have great expertise as a professor, or if you have a great network, a large network, that also gives you power, and that power may also be used or abused. And I would say that the severity of power abuse hinges on how long-lasting the likely effects there are, and also on how big the difference between the actor's own expectable net benefit and the expectable net benefits of other affected parties is. That's a utilitarianist approach, basically, to defining power and power abuse. What forms can power abuse have? I always use a distinction between the forms of power abuse that are fairly generic, that happen everywhere, and forms that are more specific to the academic environment. The first 4 points on this slide here refer to the first kind. These are the more generic forms of power abuse: misuse, misappropriation, or waste of resources, exploitation, bullying, and sexual harassment or coercion. But then you also have the more academia-specific forms of power abuse, like plagiarism, scooping, so stealing ideas, data manipulation, data fabrication, and also authorship misattribution, ghost authorships and guest authorships. And you also have pseudoscience, so like huge costly projects that the people who do them do not really believe in, which is unethical too. To give you an example of how the abusiveness of certain pattern may be determined, certain behavior pattern may be determined, I'm going to go through a few examples. One of the easiest examples is probably sexual harassment. You always have the behavior of a person P in organization O, and then you look at the expectable consequences of that behavior for all the parties involved. For example, in sexual harassment, the person the person showing that type of behavior is probably trying to attain some form of gratification, sexual gratification, feeling powerful, etc. So I'm going to give that a green light, which doesn't mean that it's okay to behave that way, but like this person benefits from the behavior. And the target, the person who's being targeted here, gets a red light, which means that this person pays the price. This person is exploited, is used, right? And that's a fairly simple constellation where you probably say that if this happens within a hierarchical relationship, you would call it a form of power abuse. Exploitation, for example, when you are a professor and you force your ECRs to do types of work that they're actually not responsible for, just to, for example, alleviate yourself from certain work burdens, can also be analyzed this way. For example, if I'm a professor and I demand that my students do work that I would actually be responsible for doing, that would be, and if they comply, that would be good for me. It may also be good for the organization, actually, because the organization gets more done if I behave that way. Third parties, for example, the public, if they invest money into the organization, they may also benefit because they get more out of the organization, but they don't have to invest more money. At first sight, you will probably think that the person being exploited is being harmed, and that's probably true, right? The person is being exploited and that pays the price, but even that person might actually be seen as benefiting from that because that person will ultimately be a member of a more successful organization. I'm giving you this example to show this is actually fairly complex, right? And of course, this is already simplifying. So determining how abusive a use of power actually is often isn't that simple. It becomes even more interesting in the next example. This is about coerced data manipulation. Some of you, at least, may be familiar with being pressured to produce like impressive results. And quite often that takes the form of your advisor signaling that that's what's expected, but that person basically giving you free rein over the means that you're going to use to achieve that goal. So you're in a subtle way, you're being asked to do whatever it takes to produce impressive results. And sometimes that results in ECRs or even more postdocs manipulating data in order to produce more impressive results. And that's what I would call coerced data manipulation. If that happens, it's good for the person who leads the group, the professor who asks for the impressive results. It's also good for the organization in terms of publication record, in terms of rankings. it's actually even good for the person who is being coerced that way, because that person is also going to have more impressive results to show and may have better publication success. It is bad, however, for the public who pays this institution to produce reliable, trustworthy research and not fake research. Again, this is a bit more complex because at the same time, this is also bad for the person who's being coerced and maybe starts manipulating data in order to please her advisor, because that person can then easily be blackmailed, right? Because some people know it's quite likely that some people will know, at least suspect, that something is not right with this analysis. And it becomes even more complex and interesting if you look at the contrast between the situation in which all of this goes on undetected and the situation in which it goes undetected. Because if it's detected, then suddenly everybody is going to pay a big price in terms of reputation loss and so on, which is to show you how complex these analyses are, but also to show you that there's often quite a strong motive to keep these things hidden and not make them visible. Actually, a motive for the institution, for everybody in the institution. Which brings me to an important point. I have had the experience that many people want to believe that organizations always have ethical goals. And that's probably not true. Sometimes organizations have an interest in their employees acting unethically, and academic institutions are not an exception. There's a term for that from the work in organizational psychology literature called unethical pro-organizational behavior, which is, according to Umphreys and Bingham, defined as actions intended to promote the effective functioning of the organization or its members and that violate core societal values, mores, laws, or standards of proper conduct. Okay. Quickly, a few more things about prevalence. So how often does all this occur? Honestly, we do not have enough reliable data on the prevalence of these various forms of power abuse in academia specifically. And the main reason for that is the lack of representativeness. So the available data may reflect some degree of over or underreporting, right? It is possible that the people who have the most severe stuff to report aren't in academia anymore. Or it's possible that the people who have the most severe stuff to report take part in these surveys more often than the other people, and that would lead to an overestimation of the effect. So long story short, we don't know exactly. We just know that this happens, that there's a substantial amount of unethical misconduct going on, but we don't have very reliable exact numbers. The few studies that do exist suggest levels of bullying and sexual harassment similar to those reported for work environments outside of academia. And scientific misconduct also seems to be fairly common, especially the milder forms, which have been called questionable research practices like p-hacking and harking. I hope you know what that means. If you don't, ask me. But the use of QRPs, of questionable research practices, often is already sufficient to discredit your scientific work entirely, which is why QRP is kind of a misnomer or basically a euphemism for this approach. The most common form of scientific misconduct, that is something we know fairly clearly, is guest and honorary authorships. So people amassing authorships that they do not really deserve. Very often by abusing the power that they have, for example, as a group leader or even as an institutional leader. Okay, 2 more slides. We don't have very reliable numbers, but we do have all these case examples, and I would like to show you a few of those. Just reading the headlines here from some media reports that came out in the past few years. Over half of psychology studies fail reproducibility test. UC Berkeley professor fired nearly 2 years after sexual harassment claims substantiated. She's the world top empathy researcher, but colleagues said she bullied and intimidated them. There's far more scientific fraud than anyone wants to admit. Top German psychologist fabricated data, investigation finds. The deadly legacy of a stem cell charlatan, devastating report, how archaeologist couple got away with misconduct, intimidation, alcohol abuse, and theft. prominent Dutch astronomer barred for extremely unacceptable behavior. Psychologists committed fraud in 15 articles, how test subjects kept disappearing, the business school scandal that just keeps getting bigger, and so on and so on. Just to give you, and this is just a small selection, so there's many more. I mean, there's a reason why we're here, and there's a reason why you're attending. There is a problem. We don't know exactly how big it is, but there is a problem. There's a model. I'm a bit hesitant to call this a model. It's more like a narrative. Psychology has relatively weak, relatively fuzzy models, but that doesn't mean that they're completely useless. This is one that I like. Doesn't mean that I think it's perfect, but it's helpful. It's called the toxic triangle, and it highlights one point that I like in particular, that unethical behavior patterns in any institution are usually the result of a complex interaction between several factors. And three of those are highlighted by the model: destructive leaders, susceptible followers, and conducive environments. And I'm going to talk about these now. Let's start with the destructive leaders. On the left-hand side, you see a couple of terms that personality psychologists use to describe certain personality dispositions: psychopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism, antagonism, honesty, humility, antisocial personality. There are whole literatures surrounding these terms, but the good news is there's probably like a common core. And I very much like this paper by Moshagen and colleagues from 2018, I think it is, where they talk about the dark factor of personality. And they claim, and I think they're largely right, that this is what actually matters. And this is the common core of most of these other factors. And people with high levels in D, in this dark factor, will generally aim to maximize their individual utility at the expense of the utility of others, which is basically another way of saying you're trying to benefit at other people's expense. And that's very close to what we have already been talking about when I talked about how can power abuse be defined. This just makes the point that some people are more inclined to actually abuse the power that they have for their own benefit, and they're more willing to let other people pay for that. I'm not going to talk about this in detail, just want to mention this. There's a very, I would say, important and even inspiring paper by Forster and Lund. It's called Identifying and Dealing with Functional Psychopathic Behavior in Higher Education. I can only recommend this to you because this basically highlights what happens if someone with a very high level in this D factor, someone who's really willing to do everything it takes to be successful and who has no scruples, who has no hesitation to let other people pay for that, if such a person attains a powerful position in academia. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to skip the next 3 slides because it would just be too much, but I highly recommend this paper. It's very good. So if you don't have high levels in this D level, you might be called a person with integrity. And that's actually a label that is being used for the other end of that continuum. And here on this slide, I'm introducing a decades-old idea that's being used in social psychology and personality psychology. It's the idea of a person-environment interaction. So you want to explain why some behavior happens. You look at the person and you look at the environment and you look at how they interact. And this is a completely hypothetical pattern. This is not based on any data. It's just to make a point, just to clarify an idea. And the idea is that there's 3 influences. One is the person influence, here symbolized by the difference between the red line and the green line. You see that some people are just more willing, more ready to show unethical behavior than other people. And that's just the point I made with the dark factor of personality. But also you have an environmental influence, and that's what's symbolized by the 2 points on the x-axis here. You might have a robust system in which everybody is held in check a bit and is not permitted to show as much unethical behavior. Or you might have a vulnerable system in which people may basically do as they please. And in the latter type of environment, everybody is going to show a bit more unethical behavior. And then on top of that, you might also have an interaction effect, and that is that in a vulnerable environment, certain people will be will feel especially entitled to act unethically. And that's why the two lines here have different slopes. It's a very simple idea, but I think it is powerful and is probably helpful in understanding the actual cases that we're confronted with. So let's look at these two types of system, right? We just talked about the people. I think that's basically done now, like the individual differences variable. Let's also look at the environment. And in the toxic triangle, the environment is represented by the conducive environment and also by the susceptible followers, because you also need other people who go along with your unethical inclination, right? So if you want to act unethically, it's almost certain that other people will notice, and then then it's going to be important how they react to that, and that's where we have the bystander phenomenon come back in again. So I was talking about power abuse, and the potential for power abuse, of course, grows with the amount of power that someone has. So at some point, a few years ago, I started asking myself, what powers do professors have just by being a professor? And there's actually quite a bit of power that professors have. They have the power to give jobs, to extend contracts, at least in Germany. They can choose research topics. They can act as references for younger researchers. They can grant or not grant co-authorships on papers, access to data. They can hand out funds, for example, travel funds, conference fees, and so on. They are being listened to by their colleagues, for example, or also by the public. Yeah, right? Just because you have a professor's title, it gives you a certain level of credibility, which is why you will be asked to comment on stuff, for example, and other people won't be asked because they're not professors. That's also a source of power. You have a relatively good payment, so you can pay for good legal advice, which many younger researchers cannot afford. You can appoint other professors. You can decide who to work with or not to work with. You can give younger researchers access to a network, or you refuse to do that. You can write reviews for papers, for grants. You give grades. You can assign or delegate tasks. You can set deadlines, and so on. So there's actually quite a bit of power. And most of the analysis that I'm aware of come to the same conclusion that there's that this is too much power given to too few people, so that we need a better distribution of power. Like we need more equality in terms of who's allowed to do what. I also have a slide on what protects the perpetrators. I'm going to skip that just to show you there's a lot of factors in the system that protects perpetrators from being caught and sanctioned, which is why most cases of power abuse remain unsanctioned. Probably almost all cases of power abuse, at least in the current academic system, remain unsanctioned. I'm just going to highlight one important issue, and that's on this slide here. This is from a study that we conducted at our university, at Technische Universität Dresden, with friendly support from the university leadership, and where we asked people whether they had ever experienced certain types of sexual harassment or sexual coercion. And we had thousands of people participate in this. And here you see different forms of sexual harassment or coercion, starting from the relatively mild forms all the way down to the really severe forms, including rape. And we had people who said, one of our very first questions was whether people had ever experienced this. And the people who had never experienced these different forms, they were asked, if you experienced this, would you report it? Would you make it the subject of a complaint? And expectably, there were some forms where almost nobody said that they would make a complaint about this, but there were also forms where almost everybody said that they would that they would file a complaint. Of course, like the most severe forms down here are the ones basically we defined these as being severe in terms of the expected reporting rates. You also see the prevalences here. Quite expectably, the milder forms of sexual harassment and coercion were the most common forms, and the more severe these forms became, the less common they were. But now the most important question, I think, would be the people who actually have experienced this, who said in our survey that they had experienced this, did they report what they had experienced? And you see that even with the most severe forms, including actual sexual attack, rape, the actual reporting rate was well below 20%. So there's a huge gap between what people think they would do if they experience some form of sexual harassment or coercion and what they actually do when they do experience it. And this is a pattern that I think, based on everything that I know, is quite typical for all forms of power abuse, and probably not even only in academia, but in all organizations. People usually do not report what they experience, but that and they have good reasons for that in many cases, but that leads to the perpetrators getting away with it. Okay. Any more questions?
There are indeed a lot of questions coming in, so I'll just pass on a few that connect to the part you just discussed. So one question was that you mentioned that there is little reliable data on power abuse in academia, and the question was what type of studies would be needed to fill that gap? And then a connected question, if there are validated and established scales for measuring power abuse that you would recommend to use in quantitative surveys. The second one is a bit more specific.
Mm-hmm. The latter one I actually can't answer, but it shouldn't be too difficult to like do an internet search and find some. I can't answer it off the top of my head. The first question is, I think, can quite easily be answered because it's a general response that we would always give. If you want to have representative results, you need to make sure that your sample is representative, and that would mean that you have a good image of who actually works at the university that you're surveying, and then give everybody an equal chance to, so then you draw a random sample of those people and you approach them individually and you try to make sure that everybody participates, right? I can't guarantee that, for example, by paying them for participating, right? And if you have a random draw and if you have a high response rate, then your conclusions should be quite generalizable.
Yeah, thank you. Then I tried to summarize a few questions. So one was also if you think that power abuse is also an issue for doctoral researchers who are external, not employed at the university, and in general, if you think that this kind of unethical behavior is kind of more prevalent inside academia or outside. Do you have any stance here?
To the first question, I would say yes, because there are also certain dependencies involved, right? You still depend on your advisor's willingness to continue advising you and to continue recommending, basically helping you with the project. And one like intricate detail in that is like the longer this has been going on, the stronger your dependency becomes, right? Because after maybe a few months, if you realize that you don't want to work with this person anymore, you can do that and the harm will be acceptable. But if you have been working with a person for 3 years or 4 or 5 years, the harm to you, if the whole thing gets abandoned for some reason, will become bigger and bigger. And that's true for people, for external doctoral students just as much as for everybody else. And to the question of whether the problem is bigger in academia, that's a question that's asked a lot, that's being asked a lot. I don't have reliable data to prove this. I would say there are at least 1 or 2 good reasons to assume it is, because the dependencies in academia are just particularly strong. And maybe that's particularly true also in Germany. In quite a few discussions that I had about this issue, we came to the point where we conclude that for example, in the business world, if you really don't get along with your advisor, or if there's a lot of unethical behavior at the firm that you're working at the company, well, then you go to another, and it's going to work. But in academia, the world is a bit smaller because the powerful persons, they're few powerful persons, and if you are quite often they are well connected with each other. And I know of many cases in which abusive professors actually threatened the people that they abuse, that if they complain or if they don't comply, they will make sure that their career is over. And that is something I think is more realistic in the academic world than outside of it.
Yeah, but I would suggest that we continue with your presentation. I'll ask the other questions in the course as you're presenting.
Yes. Okay. The next part of I have two more parts. One is going to be about emergency responses. So if you are currently in a situation of being the victim of power abuse, what can you do? I have to say there's not much you can do. There's some things you can do to avoid like the gravest mistakes, but you still have a bad situation. And there's no way around it. It doesn't help if I tell you like you only have to do A, B, and C, and then everything will be fine, because it's really a bad situation. And then in the final part, I'm going to offer a few recommendations for structural changes that could be implemented to prevent more of the power abuse that is currently taking place. So, emergency responses. If you are currently in such a situation, document your experiences and do that in writing, and do it timely, and do it in detail. Let a second person you trust read and sign your documentation so you can prove that this actually was written in close proximity to the actual event. Collect relevant documents, for example, emails, and save them in a secure location so that you can find them also in a year or two. Gain clarity about the legal situation. You may actually be confronted with a crime. Sometimes people in academia conduct crimes? They show criminal behavior. So there may be a legal side to what you're witnessing. Connect with others you trust, and people who are victims or witnesses in similar cases or in the same case. This will provide you with emotional support, and emotional support is pretty important so you don't feel alone so much. If possible, plan on taking action against the perpetrator together. That to me is kind of key. The few cases I know in which people actually took effective action were almost always cases in which a group of people decided that they would not take it any longer. Also get independent counsel, for example, from the Network Against Power Abuse in Science. I think the main part of what they do is counseling victims who are currently exposed to power abuse, but they also help connect victims with each other. Then get in touch with a competent independent lawyer early on. If you are a member in some workers' union, like Verdi, for example, that entails the offer of free legal advice. And I know of at least one case in which that was crucial for winning against a bully. Avoid using the institution's channels, especially email, for communication about sensitive issues, because the emails that you write using your institutional account may actually be accessed by people from the institution, and I'm not sure that you want that. Avoid emotional communication, especially in writing, with the accused. So no blaming via email or whatever, because that might be used against you later on. Reflect soberly on the extent of your own dependency on the accused. What's the worst that may happen? And deal with these dependencies in a strategic manner. For example, finish your project, finish your PhD first, and then file a complaint. I actually know a case in which that was exactly how the victims proceeded. Also, just a moment. Okay, I have problems with my slides here for some reason.
We are still on the slide with the emergency responses.
Sorry.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, this one. Sorry. Also, be prepared for the worst. Anticipate strong negative responses, threats, blame shifting, bad mouthing. Anticipate attempts to manipulate you, for example, by making you feel guilty. Anticipate additional criminal behavior, like document manipulation, for example. Anticipate attempts by representatives of the institution to silence you, to gaslight you, and to shove allegations under the rug. So don't be surprised. I'm not saying that this is certain to happen, but I do know enough cases in which some of this has happened to warn you. So if you are going to take steps against a representative of your institution, all this might actually happen. So don't be surprised when it happens. Finally, reject the offer of one-on-one talks over problems, take a trustworthy witness with you, and write a memo together immediately afterwards. Agreements with the other side should always be detailed and made in writing. Maybe get the responsible complaints office involved, but do not expect too much, because as we can talk about this in more detail if you like. Most of these complaints don't lead anywhere, and quite often these are very frustrating processes in which the complainant doesn't gain much. Also, you might talk to the press, as I've been doing for quite a few time now, for quite some time now. I can assure you that witness protection is the highest priority of every responsible journalist. You might have seen this very recent report by Louis Sanders and Esther Felden on the Deutsche Welle, abuse of power at Germany's elite research institution. I've been authorized by Esther Felden and also Christine Haug from Der Spiegel to pass on their email addresses. So if you would like to contribute to this ongoing investigation, because this continues, then contact them and describe to them what you have experienced. Okay, but a disclaimer. These measures, these emergency responses, are supposed to help victims of power abuse stand their ground and limit the possible damage to themselves. They do not guarantee success in fighting power abuse or power abusers. Under the current circumstances, fighting power abuse is very awful, energy draining, and risky. Almost the entire burden of these proceedings lies with the weakest persons in the system, that is, the ECRs and the administrative staff. At present, the help of journalists is indispensable from my point of view, but investigations may still take many months, and sometimes even after they have taken many months, they still have to be buried anyway. For example, because some legal proceedings make it impossible to publish what has been investigated. So it is difficult. Therefore, we ultimately and urgently need prevention, and so not just intervention. Of course, it's helpful to have intervention, but the most relevant, the most needed prevention measure that I think we could take is a relative disempowerment of professors and research group leaders. And we're going to talk about these structural changes that we need in the next part, but maybe there are questions regarding what I just talked about now.
We have indeed a lot of questions. So maybe a short one would be why to avoid one-on-one talks, as you suggested?
Well, because that's going to be, I mean, this might actually be well intended, right? But especially like the more tense the situation already is, the more you have to expect that what is being said behind closed doors in one-on-one talks will be disputed. So you can have an agreement, for example, with your advisor over who's going to be the first author on this paper. And if this takes place behind closed doors and it's just you and the advisor, then you have no proof that this has ever taken place.
Yeah, thanks a lot. There are various questions going in the direction of that university, of course, have systems in place, but often enough they don't really help. So there are some office manager like the ombudsperson, the Vertrauensstelle. So that there's always a problem, of course, that at some point you need to reveal your anonymity to be involved. As we also saw in the documentary, maybe you can comment a bit on that, why the universities are not doing, or institutions are not doing more, or cannot always, be active here.
Wow, yeah, important question. Probably too much, too complex to answer here. Just a few snippets off the top of my head. I don't claim that this is like the ultimate answer to that question. Well, first of all, these complaint offices are quite powerless themselves in many cases. So they can't really do much. I talked to people at such offices, and I also talked to people who used those offices and to turn to them with their complaints. The responses I got was, and I know this is fairly denigrating, which is not that fair, because I know that many people who do this type of work actually mean well, right? And they spend a lot of time and energy trying to help the victims, but ultimately, often they can't. And so this type of work has been described to me as like a painkiller. You go there, you complain, and then nothing changes, but at least you could talk about it. And also another description I got actually from someone working at a complaint office, from someone who does this type of work, was our job is basically like pastoral care. And like in some cases, helping people leave without too much grievance or something like that. And I don't recall exactly, which is to say that in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, the victim ultimately leaves and the perpetrator stays in place and remains unsanctioned.
Yeah, that's unfortunately very often the case. I would maybe like to close this round of questioning with one question, food for thought. So, like, do German universities maintain records of power abuse, bullying, and harassment cases? Do such incidents affect the eligibility for third-party funding?
I don't know how many universities do that. I hope they do. I'm pretty certain that most like ombudsperson's offices and so on, they have their files. I don't know how detailed they are. I don't know what they do with the files, but I'm pretty certain that they have them. I have not heard of any case in which that was ever big consequential for third-party funding. I don't know, which is not to say
Yeah,
that
I would
it doesn't
also
happen,
doubt that,
I've
but
never
that would be
heard
actually a good measure, right, to start to really address this. So let's go back to your presentation and then address the rest of the questions later.
Final thing, and I want to do this even more briefly because I know it's just a lot to take in. And I'm going to talk about a few prevention measures, and I'm only going to mention them, and then I'm going to leave it to you to which ones I should talk about in more detail. So as I said, I was privileged to chair this commission by the German Psychological Society called AMWF, Anreizsystem, Machtmissbrauch und wissenschaftliches Fehlverhalten, which means incentive structure, power abuse, and scientific misconduct in English. And we were a group of 7 and later 8 people tasked with identifying the factors in a science system that permit or even promote unethical behavior, and to propose measures for improvement, basically structural changes. In 2023, we published our report, and there's an English version of that that has just been updated. That's available as a preprint. It's actually fairly long, like 60 pages, 70 pages or so, which is to show that, again, this is really complex. A lot of stuff goes on there. I would recommend this. This was challenging work, but it was also very rewarding work. Our group notably consisted of people from all levels of the university hierarchy, from the current student to the professor emeritus. And we recommended a number of structural changes. I'm only going to highlight a few of those. Most important, distribute the power of professors more evenly across different persons. Also strengthen external oversight. So these complaint offices need to be more independent. They need better staffing, better resources, more expertise, and also more rights. Use responsible metrics to quantify, to measure research productivity, prioritize quality over quantity, and also reduce the gameability of these indices, like, for example, impact factors and age indices and so on. Use open science, which means like make everything you do as transparent as possible. Switch to not-for-profit publishing. Establish actual quality control in academic publishing, because the peer review system that we have too often fails at that. For example, check analysis results, actually check them, check the pre-registration that was done, require replication, and so on. There's quite a bit that you can do to improve the actual quality of the research that is being done. And also publish reviews and make them citable in order to improve on transparency, right? So who, as a reviewer, thinks that this paper written by someone else should be published or should not be published? And if you make that transparent, for example, you could make visible these like invisible networks where people, for example, help each other all the time getting their papers published. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that and ask you for more questions if you have any.
There are indeed a lot of questions. So there are a lot of questions in between about authorship. So the in the very beginning was a question how to deal with authorship misattribution, and I would connect it maybe to another one, which came a bit later about if you could like not pass this discussion on to the journals if there's no way to solve this as your institution. Like if there's a authorship conflict with your PI maybe, and do you think it's not solvable there? If it's a good idea to involve the actual journal or editors.
Yeah, that does happen. That does happen, right? And there are conflicts that are then need to be resolved at the like when the manuscript has already been submitted and so on. I think that's basically the worst case scenario when it has gotten that far. I think two things. First of all, in our report, we recommend using collaboration agreements that from the beginning of scientific collaboration clarify certain things, including authorship in written form. So at the very beginning, for example, it is clarified that the PhD student will generally be the first author on all the papers that she publishes from this project. There may be exceptions, but this would be the starting point. So you should have written agreements on authorships. And also, this whole concept of authorship itself has become more and more, I would say, views on that have become more and more skeptical. There is a suggestion that I like very much, and that is to limit the number of authorships. So you're not a more wonderful researcher anymore if you have 20 authorships per year, as opposed to another person who only has 10. But you are allowed, or you allow yourself to become an author on 5 papers per year and no more. And then it's your job to distribute those to the papers that you think deserve it the most. And then the incentive to become an author on as many papers as possible would be gone.
That's an interesting idea. It also goes a bit in the direction of limiting maybe the number of PhD students you can have at a time, but
Same there.
we also have from time,
Exactly
yeah.
the same. Yeah.
Mm. There were a couple of questions about the postdoc perspective, since most of the participants here are, of course, postdocs. So one is like, what can you do as a postdoc, particular when you're in the sandwich position? But there was also another question that mentioned that you, as a postdoc, might also already be in between, like being victim and perpetrator at the same time because of the pressures of the system. So maybe you have any tips here on how to prevent that?
Difficult. And I think it's important to acknowledge how difficult this is because the dependencies are just running so deep, right? So the responsibility for changing this system basically lies with all of us, but mostly it lies with professors because they are the ones who have by far the greatest power in the system. Fortunately, I know of quite a few colleagues who already like made it to the top of the hierarchy, who see many of these things basically the same way that I see them. So they also have a very critical view of this. There is a newly formed network called the Network for Sustainable Science, which only consists of professors and who have basically the same goals. I would say they share probably like 80-90% of the goals that I articulated here. There is not too much that you can actually do to change things as a postdoc. What you can do is talk about this stuff, have events in which you like highlight the importance of these issues, and also get professors, get progressive-minded professors involved, right? So get in touch with them and ask them to help you. Given your relatively powerless situation as a PhD student and also as a postdoc, it's hard to. I don't have any better news, right? So you probably need the help of the most powerful people in the system, who are the professors. Pretty certain.
Thanks a lot. There's in between a question if like the occurrence of power abuse differs among genders. Did you collect any data there or any feedback?
Well, what I can say clearly is that the victims of sexual harassment and coercion are vastly almost always women, and the perpetrators are almost always men, like in a heterosexual context. So the ratio there is like 10 to 1 or something. So that's very much a male perpetrator, female victim thing. Apart from that, all the other forms, I have no evidence for gender imbalance, and I actually make it a point in when I talk about this stuff that I sometimes there's this assumption that we need more female leadership, and then this is going to be less of a problem. I would say, of course, we need more female leadership, but I would just say that this is going to give women just the same chance as men to act like bullies or not act like bullies. It's not going to be the solution, and I know too many cases in which women do act like bullies and actually cause severe trouble. So I have no evidence for a gender imbalance in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Then there was another question was directed a bit towards the documentary we saw, and if the problem of power abuse is more prevalent in some type of institutions than others. Maybe you have a comment on that. And the other part of the question was if there are any positive examples of best practice institutions that we could learn from.
I would say also, again, we don't have reliable numbers that would permit me to give you like definitive answers to question of that type. I can only base my answers to those questions on the many cases that I know, like dozens of cases. And yes, I'm pretty certain that institutions differ in terms of ethical climate. There are institutions that are highly permissible to all sorts of unethical behavior, and there are others in which are much more restrictive. I'm pretty certain that it's like not equal everywhere. Mm-hmm. I would assume that those institutions that give the most power to their leadership are also the ones who are most susceptible to power abuse. That's just plausible, right? Doesn't mean that everybody who has a lot of power is going to be an abuser, but the chance for becoming an abuser is just greater. And the second question was, sorry, don't remember it.
If there are any examples for good practices, like institutions that you found maybe in the studies that are doing a good job here, or also on an international level, this could be a comparison.
Yeah, I do know that in Berlin, the philosophy department, I think it's the HU, the Humboldt University, they have been experimenting with more egalitarian leadership models, which is exactly the way that we should go into. So, and they're actually quite advanced with that. It's just one department, right? And I do know, I think there's another department at the same university that emulated that, but it's a very small beginning, but it is a beginning. And also in terms of, open science and also publishing behavior and so on, there's a lot of positive development there. I'm going to show you those. Okay, you see there's quite a bit.
Interesting. You do have a lot of material here that you didn't show. Yeah,
I didn't want to overwhelm you, right? It's just too much. So there are actually examples for, I think, very positive examples for better publishing models. I want to highlight Metapsychology, which is a journal that is completely not for profit. It's just run by a community of dedicated scholars who don't earn a single euro with this. It's just like it's an idealistic project. It's diamond open access, so nobody is paying anything for anything here. Nobody profits in any financially from this work. It has a mandatory preprint policy, so you only can submit a journal to this a manuscript to this journal if you submit a preprint first. So everybody is going to see what you have submitted. The reviews are also published, so the entire process is transparent, and so on. So that's the direction that we should go into. The Psych Open Gold project by the Leibniz Institute for Psychology in Trier is also offering a very similar approach with their not-for-profit journals, diamond open access journals that everybody can read on the entire world, provided they have an internet access, of course. So there is positive development there. And also I want to mention this, the research quality evaluation framework, which is something I've also been involved with. This is to make quality standards in research more comparable, also stricter and more transparent, and can be used for evaluating papers that have already been published. For example, in the course of hiring or promotion procedures, right? So this is explicitly supposed to replace indices like the H index, for example, which are highly manipulable and also manipulated quite a bit, and replace that kind of evaluation by an evaluation in terms of methodological rigor.
Yeah, thanks. There are also a few questions that go in the direction of your opinion on DORA and Quora and how to change the evaluation system, but I think this is probably also something that goes in the same direction.
This is basically an attempt to implement that. Yeah, it's actually in the paper in the papers where we present this, we explicitly reference DORA and Quora. This is the idea. This is one suggestion. I think it's actually quite a good suggestion. Probably not that surprising that I'm saying this. A suggestion as to how the general principles outlined in DORA and Quora may actually be implemented in practice.
Yeah, it's maybe a good example to look at then for positive examples. There were a few questions here which go more in the direction of the success rate. If you feel like you're a victim of power abuse and would like to complain, what can we do to encourage more people to speak up and also to maybe raise the chances that you're successful with your complaint?
Yeah, well, the emergency responses I presented, those are the best advice that I can give. And as I said, they won't make it certain that you're going to be successful. Actually, it is dangerous to complain in the system because of the power imbalance. And if you complain about somebody who is really powerful and sufficiently unethical, they will retaliate quite likely, right? And so it is risky. And I know of many cases in which the people working in complaint offices, for good reason, advise potential complainants not to file a complaint.
It's a very unfortunate situation, but I think we need maybe more of these reports and more of these examples to really address the topic.
I think we need more external oversight, but what we need the most, again, I'm repeating myself, is a more egalitarian leadership structure, because then the potential for retaliation, for example, is also going to become smaller.
And from the perspective of an institution, there are a lot of questions go in this direction. What is required from an institution to make sure that there is less power abuse, or that we can really pursue and persecute these cases? Do you think there's any focus on that? Or any recommendations you can give?
I would say that the one thing that academic institutions should experiment with is more egalitarian leadership structures. So more collaborative, cooperative structures with less of a hierarchy in them. And I think it's certainly possible. It's just a matter of culture. We have an outdated cultural model that has to be overcome, and that takes basically political will, but it is absolutely possible, no question. And institutions also can do a lot to support transparency. So open science practices, for example. Yeah.
There are still really a lot of questions coming in also while we are talking, but it's already 2 o'clock. So maybe Judith, do you want to join us again? I know if you have any very pressing questions that are remaining that you see or that you would like to ask Professor Leising.
I think there were several questions again about the reports that you did or were you part of. Why do you think the reporting number is so low? Because between the percentage of how much would people report and how much is actually reported, it's a vast difference. Is it because the consequences of reporting can be severe and the positive outcomes are probably less likely?
There's a paper in which this is published. You can read about this because, of course, we asked people why they abstained from reporting. Yes, fear of retaliation is a major factor. But also, there were some things that I at least found surprising. Often, if it's really severe, if something that happened is really severe, you know that reporting this might actually cost the other person her position or whatever. And then sometimes people have a motive to protect the perpetrator. And the more severe the incident was, the more re-traumatizing it will be to complain about it. So many people just want to leave everything behind. So which is kind of bizarre, but it's also very understandable. The more severe the experience, the higher your motive of leaving it behind is going to be. You just don't want to deal with it anymore. But ultimately, that is going to protect the perpetrator as well.
A very conflicting situation the people are in there. Another question that I like a lot because it's about what can we do and how can we actually change these structures. You talked several times about reducing the power of professors and changing things and be more cooperative within universities. Can you elaborate a bit more of how that actually could look like? How could a system look like where professors have less power, less chance for power abuse, without having to overthrow the whole academic system as we know it right now? Or would that actually be necessary?
Yeah, again, I can't give a definitive answer here. I just can present a few ideas that I've been like talking about for years. One thing was already mentioned. It's actually quite simple to make it the rule that the people involved in the work, for example, PhD advisors, have nothing to do with evaluating the same work. That's something that can basically be implemented fairly like with almost no effort. You just have to change the regulation at your university, I think. It's more demanding to change these employment structures. So who's actually your boss? But again, this department at the HU in Berlin, they have changed their employment model. So you don't have this that much of a hierarchy anymore. I don't know all the details about that, but I would definitely recommend looking into that. They have published about that. There's papers in which they describe how to do that and how they did that, how they alleviated the existing imbalance in their own department. Well, just my own experience is when I work on something scientific, I work with all sorts of people, professors, sometimes students, and the hierarchy, it seems to me, doesn't play much of a role there. So it's basically it's not needed, right? Sometimes people look to the more senior people for advice, for guidance, and so on, and that's perfectly okay. But I've very rarely, if ever, encountered a situation in which it was necessary for me to basically order someone else to do something. So my own experience is that science works best in such an environment where people just voluntarily try to help each other achieve the best result. But you would still have to have someone who signs the contracts for people. And I think maybe the American model, the department model, in which people are employed at the department and not like the employees of a particular person, would be an improvement over the model that we have now. I've actually talked with a colleague from the States about that particular point, because this department model was mentioned to me again and again as a possible solution. And we did conclude that it would probably be an improvement as opposed to the model that we have now in Germany.
One last question. Professors and institutions, that those, as we saw in the beginning of your talk, might benefit from power abuse in different ways. How is your feeling? How big is the interest actually among this group to change something about the system, about the fact that their power abuse appears? They also read the reports in the newspapers and the press that we read in the past. And I can imagine that, of course, you always have both. You have people that are allies and you have people that really want to benefit, and I have no issues with that. But do you have a feeling about, is it more that people would want to do things, but they don't find the right measures? Or is it actually really very dark and people are just happy the way it is, and we are kind of lost as early careers researchers in a horrible system?
Very good question. I don't know. I have encountered both. We're already over time, right? I would like to close on an encouraging note. I think what we're doing right now here, but also all the media reports coming out and so on. So the awareness is rising pretty quickly. I had not expected this to ever happen. Like if you had asked me like 3 years ago, I would never have expected so much movement on these fronts to begin. So I'm actually fairly optimistic that we're going to see maybe even major changes. And I think that the role of the press always reporting on this and actually continuing to report on this, as I think I mentioned, I'm aware of of several investigations going on right now will be, I think, will continue to be important. Like the public awareness, because I mean, basically the public pays for our work, right? So the public needs to know what's going on. And I'm not saying that it's all rotten and bad, right? I know many colleagues that I respect perfectly, that I have perfect trust in, no question. But we do have a problem with unethical actors, too many, too unethical in the system. I'm not saying it's guaranteed that the situation is going to improve, but the chances have never been better. Let's put it that way.
Thank you so much for your positive outlook. I hope it is. We in the German Postdoc Network definitely want to continue to raise awareness of the topic, but also be part of discussions of what we can do. It will be hard to give actually individual advice if you're in a situation of power abuse, what to do. We can from now on recommend the lists of measures from Professor Leising. Thank you so much for that. I think it's a good starting point. But I do think that actually change of the culture is necessary to really move things away from the current situation. And from all what I heard today, this is what we need and this is where we want to go. There are some ideas what we can do. Maybe not all ideas have come up yet. So continue to be part of the discussion. Maybe support each other in the community. Peer networking and peer mentoring are very strong factors. And the stronger we are as a community and hold together, the less isolated are people and less susceptible for power abuse. So that is something that we can do as postdocs, as early career researchers. Thank you so much, Professor Leising, for being here today, for giving this talk, for answering so many questions. There's still more than 30 questions in the chat. We're so sorry that we didn't have time to discuss more things in detail, but maybe we can also share some contact information. And if you have some more questions, you can reach out to the network or reach out to us again. Thank you so much, Nele, for moderating our Q&A session. It was challenging with the
I tried my best today. It was quite challenging to follow up, but I hope I did some justice to the questions here.
Yeah, you did very well, thank you. In the chat, you can find links to our newsletter, to upcoming events, and to the feedback form. We will also send it out via email. Please fill it out. It will help us to tailor our talks to your needs in the future. Last word goes to our speaker, Professor Leising, and I wish you a nice afternoon afterwards.
Thank you. I don't have anything to add. Just thank you for inviting me. And thank you for all the questions.
Oh, and thank you for all your activism at work. I think that's very important to see for early career researchers that there are professors like you who are working on improving the system.
And I wish you all a good afternoon and goodbye.